Okay, so you sent this over, this new interview with Jesse Michels, Michels Like the Car, and Dr. Stephen Greer,
Right.
and it just came out yesterday.
Yeah, it just hit American Alchemy yesterday.
On American Alchemy, so hot off the presses. And
Yeah, it's a doozy.
you know what we do here.
Yeah, we take the fire hose
We
and
try to,
distill it down to
distill it,
for the drops.
Exactly right. The drops that make you go,
That's right. That's right.
So let's dive into this Greer and Michels conversation.
Let's deep dive it. Yeah, think of it as your shortcut so you get the core of what was discussed, the surprising claims, recurring themes, and you don't have to sit there for an hour and a half and try to make sense of it all yourself.
Yeah, or 3 hours, however long it was.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So really, what are we talking about here? What's the sort of the headline?
So there's a few things that I think are really, really compelling.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're talking about a document that Greer is saying is basically a presidential briefing document. And he's making the claim that it offers a pretty significant look behind the curtain.
Okay.
Then you've got Greer, who's surprisingly pretty optimistic about the current administration.
Yeah.
In terms of UAPs. And then you've got Greer, who's very, very much against what he considers misinformation in the UFO world.
Right.
And then, of course, you've got some pretty extraordinary claims surrounding hidden technologies and a shadowy, powerful group.
Yeah, this is classic Greer territory, right?
Right.
This is what he's been talking about for decades.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know what's important to keep in mind, too, is that this is a dynamic video interview. So the way that this information comes out is through their dialogue. It's not like Greer is giving a presentation. It's a conversation.
Right.
So we get these claims, we get these perspectives as they emerge through their conversation, through their questions, through their answers.
So let's start with this briefing document. So Jesse Michels brings it up pretty early on in the interview and describes it as an incredible this briefing for the president.
Right.
From Greer, and then Greer himself goes on to say that it's been cleaned up, redacted things and made it available to the public. But what's really interesting is he says this public version contains 90+% of what the new president has.
Right. And he refers to this throughout as the Disclosure Project Briefing Document 2025. So I think he's trying to really underline, the importance of it for leadership right now. And, regardless of what you believe about Greer or anything that he's ever said, the fact that there is a document and he's claiming that, it's a briefing document and the president has a huge amount of it's now been made public. I mean, that in and of itself is really significant.
Yeah, I mean, it directly challenges the narrative that we've heard for so many years that the government is either just completely ignorant of all this or they're denying everything, and it's just not true.
True, yeah.
So let's talk about some of the things that he claims are in this document because, I mean, some of this stuff is straight out of a thriller.
It is.
He talks about a map that shows where all the key black sites are and where all this stuff is, and this is all based on, intelligence from whistleblowers.
Right, and that to me, paints a picture of a vast clandestine infrastructure operating in the shadows.
Right, exactly.
So, you've got all these hidden places where people are working on studying, perhaps developing these advanced technologies.
Right, yeah. So then there's also a top secret CIA document from 1962, allegedly signed by James Jesus Angleton, who's a former CIA counterintelligence chief.
Right.
And supposedly it contains a wiretap of Marilyn Monroe, and he says that this was just days before she died, and it was her threatening a press conference. So, there's a little bit of like historical intrigue here because, we have this beloved cultural icon who is now somehow tied to this world of secrets and potential conspiracies.
Right. It almost suggests that the secrecy surrounding UFOs could actually have played a part in some very significant historical events.
Yeah.
And it just adds this really compelling layer to it.
Right. And then there's this 1950 top secret Canadian government document that supposedly informed Wilbur Smith that UFO secrecy was more secret than the development of the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
So
more secret than the H-bomb.
More secret than the H-bomb. Think about that for a second.
It's amazing. I mean, it really underlines the alleged scale and duration of this information lockdown.
Because this isn't just some recent phenomenon.
No.
According to this document.
No, it goes way back.
This goes back decades. and it's potentially globally coordinated. I mean, this was going on even before a lot of the events that we typically associate with, the modern UFO era. So the implication is that this is a deeply entrenched system of secrecy that has been going on for generations.
Right. And one of the things that Greer mentions, which I found really interesting, is that his group used what he calls a UNOD military technique.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, he clarified that it stands for unless otherwise directed.
Okay.
And he said that they used this back in the late 90s to basically declare these covert UFO programs illegal.
Wow. So he was trying to use existing military protocol to go after these clandestine operations.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really bold. I mean, he's trying to operate within these frameworks that already exist.
Yeah.
Albeit in a very unconventional way to expose and potentially even dismantle these hidden programs.
Yeah. And then he also mentions a one-sheeter that outlines the myth versus the truth of the UFO phenomenon.
Right.
And it goes on to identify the purveyors of the myth. So it sounds like he's basically laying out his definitive interpretation and pointing fingers at those who he believes are intentionally misleading the public.
Right. And this leads us, I think, directly to his surprisingly optimistic view of the current administration.
Yeah. So this is really interesting because, we've all heard Greer talk about, government secrecy and all this. And then here he is saying that he believes this administration is the most open to UAP disclosure since Bill Clinton's first term.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a big change in tone, for sure.
So where is all this optimism coming from?
Well, he highlights, his institute's nonpartisan approach, that they've engaged with various administrations globally over the years.
Okay.
He also says that he's working with very senior people relevant to this issue and national security who are close to the administration and were even before the election. So it sounds like, he's cultivated some contacts within the current power structure. And he really believes that there are people in positions of influence who are receptive to his message and potentially even willing to act on it.
Right. And yet you can still hear that little bit of caution in his voice.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's not naive.
Right.
His long-standing belief in a powerful global cabal that's actively suppressing this information definitely colors his expectations.
Yeah, he sees a window of opportunity.
Yeah.
But he also knows that there's some very powerful forces out there that are trying to stop this.
That are working against disclosure. Yeah.
Yeah, so there are definitely a few moments in the interview that are pretty charged.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when he gets interrupted.
Oh, yeah.
Or when certain individuals are mentioned.
Right.
And you can really kind of sense a shift in the atmosphere. Like early on, he's talking about this technology, and Michaels interrupts him, and he says, just let me finish. Let me finish the story. You keep interrupting me, but I will tell you if you'll let me finish the really high-tech stuff they slammed into a box. And you can just feel his eagerness to share specific details.
Yeah.
And that frustration that he has when he feels like he's about to reveal something important and somebody cuts him off.
Right. And it's interesting because this kind of comes up again and again when he talks about certain people.
Yeah. Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, Eric Davis.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. He doesn't mince words when it comes to his assessment of them.
He really doesn't.
No, he says, all three of the people you named are being told to tell part of the truth. And the partial truth is actually more damaging than saying nothing.
Wow.
So he's accusing them of spreading misinformation
by
focusing on, the unknown nature of UAPs and implying a potential non-human threat.
And I think his strongest reactions were directed at Lou Elizondo.
Yeah.
He claims Elizondo consistently says, we don't know what these are, and that there's this implication of a non-human origin and a potential threat. And he just vehemently disagrees with that, calling it a complete false narrative that could lead to a dangerous overreaction.
And he even goes so far as to say that this could lead to a World War II and a Star Wars fiasco.
Yeah.
And I think what's really striking here is Greer's just unshakable belief in his own understanding of the situation.
Right.
And, he's willing to directly confront these people who are presenting a different narrative. Like, he immediately agrees to debate Elizondo.
Right.
Which just highlights his conviction and how much he wants to challenge what he sees as a dangerous misrepresentation.
Yeah. And then there's Eric Davis when Michaels mentions that Eric Davis called Thomas Townsend Brown a phony Greer, dismisses Davis's counterintelligence.
Yeah.
So, this kind of reinforces his tendency to put everyone in the UAP field into one of two categories.
Right. You're either with me or against me.
You're either with him or you're against him.
Yeah.
You're either an ally in the pursuit of truth, or you're an agent of disinformation and suppression.
Yeah, and it reveals, I think, a very deep division within the UAP community.
Absolutely.
And Greer, has always kind of positioned himself as this figure who holds the key to the complete picture.
Right.
And he seems to view these other figures who've gained prominence with a lot of suspicion.
Yeah. And, speaking of the complete picture, let's move on to something that has always been a cornerstone of Greer's worldview, and that's man-made UFOs and suppressed technology. So he contends that a lot of these UAPs that have been observed since the late 1950s are not extraterrestrial at all. They're actually human engineered. And he points to things like the Nazi disc.
Right.
And Thomas Townsend Brown's work on electrogravitics as the origin of all this.
Right, and he even gives a timeline. He claims that by October 1954, we'd already mastered gravity control.
So what does that mean?
Well, I mean, this isn't just about faster engines. This is about manipulating space-time.
Wow.
Using electromagnetic fields. So you're talking about something that's way beyond anything we've ever publicly acknowledged as being possible.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting, because then he starts talking about suppressed free energy technology.
Right.
And he tells this story about the former chairman of a Fortune 50 company who supposedly wanted to disclose decades of suppressed free energy technology and was met with threats. I mean, this is a classic element of so many conspiracy narratives.
It is, yeah.
And he ties this all together by saying that, this suppression is being driven by these powerful economic interests who are vested in the existing energy infrastructure. Yeah. I mean, he even goes so far as to say that what people are reporting as alien abductions are 100% covert human programs.
Right. Yeah. So he's basically saying that, there are these advanced human craft out there that are using technology that is so far beyond anything that we've ever, publicly acknowledged.
And he actually goes on to describe these advanced craft. And he says they utilize electromagnetic field space-time bubbles, and they achieve what he calls 1G control at extreme velocities. I mean, that just sounds like it's straight out of science fiction.
Right.
Way beyond our current public understanding of aerospace engineering.
Right. And he even makes a very specific assertion about a UAP event. He says that the tic-tac that was observed by David Fravor, which, that's the case, that's really fueled so much speculation about non-human technology. Yeah. He says that was most likely a man-made craft from Lockheed Skunk Works.
Wow.
So he's directly challenging, the prevailing interpretation of that incident.
And this kind of leads us to mind control and psionics, right?
Right.
Which are things that Greer seems to believe are not just theoretical, but are actually happening.
Right. He talks about P3 operators as examples of, this human-machine interface with ET vehicles. And he tells this personal story from the early 90s about how he was offered a headset that enabled remote viewing.
Wow.
And this was back in the 50s, but he says he declined because of the risks involved.
So he's saying that this technology operates not just through, principles that we understand, but through a deeper connection between consciousness and the nature of reality.
Right. It's not just physics. Yeah. It's something more than that.
Yeah. So obviously with all these remarkable claims, we have to talk about verification and credibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Greer does talk about his process for vetting these whistleblower testimonies. And he really emphasizes the importance of cross-corroboration.
Right. He says, you have to have multiple sources saying the same thing for it to be credible.
Yeah. And he actually gives a specific example. He talks about how in 1997, someone was supposed to be in a briefing for Congress.
Right.
But they were found to be including demonstrably false information. So they were removed.
Right.
So that shows that, at least he's aware of the need to be accurate.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So this all leads us to this concept of the global cabal, which is something that Greer talks about a lot. It's a really central theme in his narrative, and he's very specific about this. He describes it as a highly influential, transnational, corrupt organization. Yeah. And he believes they are the main reason for all the secrecy.
Right, and it's not just about, hiding information. He says they're involved in murder abductions.
Wow.
All in service of maintaining control over this advanced technology.
And he says they have influence over governments all over the world.
Right.
And they're suppressing technologies that would threaten, all their their financial interests in the things like oil, gas, coal, nuclear, wind, and solar power.
Yeah. He even makes the claim that the whole narrative about an alien threat is a CIA psychological warfare operation.
Wow.
Designed to unite the world under a totalitarian superstate.
So he's basically saying that, that the fear and concern about UAPs is a lie.
Right. It's a manipulation. It's not an external threat. It's an internal one.
Yeah, and he talks about his interactions with people like General Stubblebine, Lawrence Rockefeller, and offers his own interpretations of their roles and motivations within all of this.
And he even talks about Bob Lazar.
Yeah.
And suggests that maybe his claims are a mix of genuine information and intentional disinformation.
Interesting.
That it was a controlled leak designed to obfuscate the truth.
Yeah, and Majestic 12.
Yeah. Yeah, he sees Majestic 12 as, potentially misleading, but a real operation within counterintelligence.
So it's like he's trying to piece together this puzzle that's deliberately fragmented and distorted.
Exactly.
And he tells the story about how he was offered $2 billion in 1992 to join Stubblebine's group.
Right.
Which really emphasizes, the alleged scale and the reach of this organization.
Right.
But his refusal, really shows how committed he is to his own path.
Right, to his own disclosure.
Yeah, to his own disclosure.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Greer's views on the intentions of non-human intelligence.
Okay.
Because, a lot of this conversation has been about these negative forces.
Right.
But he does talk about, his belief that a lot of extraterrestrial civilizations are not hostile at all.
Yeah.
They're actually benign. He even says closer to an angel than a demon.
Yeah, and he even says that there are cosmic protocols in place that prevent hostile extraterrestrial civilizations from leaving their own solar systems.
That's kind of reassuring.
It is, yeah.
It's not this, this terrifying picture of the universe that some people paint.
Right.
But he makes a really important distinction between, these genuine extraterrestrial craft, human-made vehicles that are designed to look like them, and then these nasty entities from other dimensions.
Right.
And he says that these are all deliberately conflated to cause confusion and fear.
Yeah.
And he talks about C5 contact, which is his own method for engaging with these intelligences. And he says it's a peaceful invitation.
Right.
Not a forceful summoning.
Not a summoning, yeah.
And to be clear for our listeners, when he talks about C5 contact, he's talking about...
Yeah, he's talking about this process of conscious communication and invitation.
Yeah, like reaching out.
Reaching out, yeah.
And inviting them to communicate with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he shares a personal account of an event that happened in Florida in 1992 where he says 4 extraterrestrial craft appeared during a C5 contact attempt. So this is kind of his key piece of anecdotal evidence to support his claims.
So then the conversation turns to weapons in space.
Right.
And the dangers of weaponization. And Greer claims that scalar technology, which is embedded in EMP weapons, can disrupt interstellar communication and travel. And he sees Reagan's Star Wars initiative as a black budget front for all these clandestine projects related to UFOs. So, it's like there's this long history of hidden agendas and technology being developed in secret, all under the guise of national security.
Right. And then he issues a really stark warning.
Yeah.
He says any act of targeting or shooting down extraterrestrial craft could be interpreted as an act of war.
Wow.
By more advanced civilizations. And he even says that the organization that's controlling this technology is a threat not just to Earth, but to other worlds.
So this is really raising the stakes.
Oh, yeah.
He's saying that the actions of a few people on Earth could have these huge ramifications for the entire galaxy.
Right, yeah.
So the interview is packed with all these references to specific people and events.
It is.
And he talks about Bob Beckwith and his neutrino light detector, which was supposedly seized by the NRO for satellite-based UFO detection and weaponization.
And then he makes this wild claim that the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand might have been caused by the testing of a similar neutrino light system at the South Pole.
Wow.
By Raytheon. I mean, that's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
And there's no publicly available evidence to support that.
And then he recounts a briefing of Admiral Wilson, who was the head of Intelligence Joint Staff back in 1997. And he claims that Admiral Wilson admitted that these man-made UFOs could outperform the B-2 stealth bomber.
Yeah.
Which, is a powerful anecdote.
It is.
About just how far ahead these secret technologies might be.
Right. And he also offers his perspective on the Philadelphia experiment.
Right.
He talks about his acquaintance with Bob Beckwith. And this just adds another layer to the historical claims surrounding, these unusual technological endeavors.
And he talks about Tesla and Thomas Townsend Brown.
Yeah.
And even mentions foreign intelligence reports about them collaborating on submarines.
Yeah.
So again, it's like he's trying to show that there's this long history of scientific advancements that have been suppressed.
Right.
And then there's this really weird claim about Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein funding abduction researchers.
Right.
To make aliens look bad.
Yeah, to create this negative public perception of extraterrestrials so that people will be more likely to support an interplanetary war and Armageddon.
So it's like he's saying that there are all these different motivations at play within this global cabal.
Right. Some people want power.
Right.
Some people want money.
Yeah.
Some people, have these bizarre end-of-the-world agendas.
Yeah, and then he says that the Betty and Barney Hill abduction was probably staged.
Right. He thinks that they were using staged craft.
Yeah.
And it was all a hoax.
And then he talks about his episode being taken down from Joe Rogan's podcast.
Right.
Because of pressure from Spotify.
Right.
And then he talks about Ben Rich from Lockheed Skunk Works, who supposedly admitted that they had technology like Star Trek.
Right.
But it was all located outside of Area 51.
Right.
So again, it's like this, this reinforcement of this idea that information is being controlled.
Right.
And that these incredibly advanced technologies exist.
Right. And
then he talks about how the U.S. military and intelligence were totally unaware of these man-made UFO crashes in Russia and Iran.
Yeah.
And he describes this incident where someone saw a man-made triangular UFO at Fort Irwin with holographic projections of other craft.
Right.
And then this witness was abducted and tortured by Raytheon operatives. So it's just like he's painting this picture of these highly compartmentalized and ruthless operations.
Ruthless, yeah.
Yeah. And then he mentions Carol Rosin and her work on a treaty to keep weapons out of space.
Right.
And her claim that Wernher von Braun, anticipated a false flag alien invasion.
Right.
And he gives his interpretation of Nixon's interest in UFOs.
Yeah, he says Deep Throat told him that Nixon was shown covert technology. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and then he offers his perspective on the lack of awareness about UFOs at the highest levels of U.S. military intelligence.
Right.
And he concludes by saying that humanity is basically a collectively insane species.
Yeah.
In the eyes of non-human intelligences because of our environmental destruction and, just constant warring with each other. And then he talks about Eisenhower meeting with extraterrestrials to try to stop nuclear proliferation.
Right.
But figures like Alan Dulles and Paul Mellon sabotage the whole thing.
Right.
So,
that's quite a deep dive.
That was a deep dive.
Yeah.
And we covered a lot of ground. Just going back to that briefing document, with all the revelations to the claim of gravity-defying technology to this global cabal.
Yeah.
The sheer volume and controversial nature of Greer's claims is just a lot to process.
It is, yeah. And I think, the implications are profound, even if only a fraction of what he's saying is true.
Yeah.
We're talking about the potential existence of these advanced secret technologies, the possibility of widespread misinterpretations of UAPs, this powerful, unelected organization that's calling the shots. It really makes you question, the nature of our reality and who's really in control.
Yeah. So for you, the listener, after hearing all this, what is the one thing that really stuck out to you, or what is the biggest question that you have?
Yeah.
What do you want to go research on your own?
Right.
Because this deep dive, into this conversation has certainly given us all a lot to think about.
Absolutely. And, dealing with claims like these requires critical thinking and, doing your own research. But I think this exploration has been really valuable for kind of giving us a framework for understanding this complex and often confusing subject.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon to explore another fascinating and thought-provoking topic that you've brought to our attention.